Hi everyone. Today we'll be looking at the key findings of the Air India preliminary investigation report that tries to get to the bottom of how the plane crashed 32 seconds after takeoff from Ahmedabad. We are left with multiple questions after the release of this report and very few answers. Here's what we know according to the report. Seconds after the plane takes off and attains maximum speed at 180 knots, fuel supply to both engines gets interrupted, gets basically cut. How did this happen? Why did it happen? Is at the heart of this aviation mystery. The report says that the fuel control switches, which actually govern the supply of fuel to both engines, were in these first few seconds in the cutoff mode instead of in the run mode. How did this happen? Well, the pilot asks his co-pilot the same question. He notices that the switches are in cutoff mode instead of in run mode. He says to his colleague in the cockpit, "Did you switch it off? Did you switch these fuel control switches in cutoff mode?" And the pilot replies, "No, I did not." The pilots then act swiftly to contain the crisis. The switches that are in cutoff mode are quickly brought back into run mode, and the engines start to show some sign of recovery. At least one does. Engine 1 shows good progress according to the report, but engine 2 is not able to control or contain the deceleration. In the meantime, because the plane is at a low height, it crashes into a building. Now, here's the big question. The preliminary investigation report flags a 2018 advisory from the FAA, that's the United States aviation regulator. This is 2018, mind you, that talks about a possible malfunctioning in the locking mechanism of these fuel control switches. Although the advisory is related in the context of the 737, the advisory does say that this possible inadvertent failure of the locking mechanism could cause problems across Boeing planes. And yet this advisory is never actually issued as a directive. It remains an advisory. In other words, much like the 737 fatal crashes where the pilots were not even aware of the MCAS system, here too, the pilots I've been speaking to say that most likely Captain Sumit and Captain Clive would not have even been aware that there was any such advisory from the FAA, mind you, not from Boeing, about the fact that there could be a problem with the locking mechanisms of the fuel control switches. Considering that there is this particular problem flagged by the FAA since 2018, why does the preliminary investigation report decide to conclude that at this stage there will be no further investigations against the 787 fleet? Instead, it only says that the report is not seeking to apportion blame, that it is only trying to prevent any such mishap from happening again. But here's the question. Unless we know what caused this crash and how it happened and how the fuel control switches went mysteriously into cutoff mode, how will a future mishap, God forbid, be prevented? How will we learn anything from this crash if we don't know specifically what caused it to begin with? In the meantime, what's really disturbing is that sections of the Western media have actually misrepresented the report, have used its open-ended language to suggest that the pilots were at fault. Worse, some have even suggested that one of the two pilots may have done this intentionally, questioning his mental health. The fact is that the report itself acknowledges that the pilots act swiftly to try and save the aircraft, their own lives, and the passengers. But what we do not know is how the plane's fuel control switches start with cutoff mode instead of run mode, which is where they're supposed to be at the time of takeoff. Until we know the answer to that, until we don't address the fact that this could be a possible malfunction in the Boeing plane, we will not know what we need to learn from this tragic air crash. Let's also acknowledge the fact that Boeing does not have a great record on air safety. The Boeing CEO is on record before the US Congress, the US Senate, conceding to lapses. We've seen the headlines recently. The Boeing leadership seems to have negotiated some sort of settlement deal with the Trump administration. But let's not forget the two fatal crashes of the 737 MAX planes. After the first one, much like this time, the pilots were blamed. Then, too, one of the pilots was an Indian. This was Lion Air. It took a second fatal crash for Boeing to actually return to the drawing board and concede that this was its own design flaw. Then, too, the pilots were not aware of the MCAS software in the 737 that they needed to be mindful of. So, this time, the question that we must ask is whether pilots who fly the 787 Dreamliner or indeed other aircraft of Boeing are aware of this advisory issued in 2018 flagging a possible locking mechanism problem with the fuel switches. In layperson's terms, what it simply means is that the fuel switches were off instead of on, which is a complete mystery. One of the pilots sees this, asks his colleague, "Did you do this?" He says, "Absolutely not." The pilots then work to bring the switches back on. Fuel supply returns to the engines. One of the engines shows progress. The second engine doesn't, but the plane is at a very low altitude and therefore crashes into a building. With so many questions open, there is one central question. Will Boeing manage to get away while the dead pilot's reputation is smeared? That is a question to which we have no answer right now because we simply do not know how the fuel control switches went into cutoff mode instead of run mode. Every pilot I've spoken to says that the pilots have the switches have a guard around them in this particular plane. And so it would be very, very unlikely for a pilot to accidentally hit one of the switches and thereby sort of, disable it. But even if hypothetically you imagine for a moment that this was possible, can it really happen twice? Each engine has its own fuel control switch. So unfortunately, where we stand today is a big, big aviation mystery. We know that fuel supply to the engines was cut a few seconds after takeoff. We know that the pilot notices it, asks his colleague, "Hey, did you do it?" The pilot categorically refutes it. We know the pilots do everything they can after that to turn the switches back on and bring the engines back to normal functioning. And we know that it was too late. What we do not know is how and why, mysteriously, the fuel control switches that should have been in run mode are in cutoff mode. And will Boeing also give us some answers about the 2018 advisory? More on this as we investigate and try and get to the bottom of this horrific crash. Thanks for watching.